It's daytime now on Sinjar Mountain in Iraq's north, where the summer sun will drive the temperature towards 50 degrees. And there's not a shadow to shade the thousands of refugees who've been trapped there by Sunni militants. Their desperation has been captured in images of people struggling to board a handful of rescue helicopters. And their plight was discussed today in the cool of Sydney in high-level talks between the United States and Australia. America has launched airstrikes to try and slow the advance of the militants, but Secretary of State John Kerry has ruled out sending combat forces back into Iraq. And both the US and Australia have agreed to take their fears about the homegrown fighters who've joined this war to the United Nations. Political correspondent Sabra Lane reports.
The contrast couldn't be more stark. In northern Iraq, desperate refugees scramble on board a helicopter to freedom, escaping Islamic State jihadists and the choice of conversion or death. While half a world away, with helicopters hovering overhead and the stunning backdrop of Sydney Harbour, US and Australian ministers gather to discuss how to stop a genocide. The annual Australia-US talks usually aren't world headline material, but the US-led bombings in northern Iraq and power struggle at the top of Iraqi politics have ensured the crisis is at the top of the agenda.
And of course, foreign fighters who go to various parts of the world, learn jihadism and come back with bad intentions. So there's a lot for us to work on together.
The turmoil in Iraq was compounded overnight when the country's president nominated Haider al-Abadi to take over from Nouri al-Maliki as Prime Minister. The incumbent, though, is showing no signs of going quietly, calling the move a dangerous violation of the country's constitution.
Now, this new Iraqi leadership has a difficult task. It has to regain the confidence of its citizens by governing inclusively and by taking steps to demonstrate its resolve. The United States stands ready to support a government that addresses the needs and grievances of all Iraqi people.
There will be no reintroduction of American combat forces into Iraq. That is the beginning of the discussion. This is a fight that Iraqis need to join on behalf of Iraq.
If you're limiting yourself to air power and advisors, it's much easier to get out than if you've got troops on the ground, and President Obama has been very clear in his public speeches that he is not in the business of putting US soldiers back in harm's way in Iraq, but he's there to provide enabling support to the Iraqi security forces, and also that ultimately the solution for Iraq is not a US military one, it's an Iraqi political and military one.
The Iraq crisis was a major feature of the annual United States-Australia ministerial defence talks in Sydney today between the US Secretary of State and Defence and their Australian counterparts. Prime Minister al-Maliki ruled Iraq for 8 years and has been blamed for alienating Sunnis and fuelling support for Islamic State forces that have swiftly taken territory across northern Iraq. The nation's new Prime Minister has 30 days to ratify his new government. The United States has made it clear future assistance will be conditional on that administration showing it's inclusive.
We are prepared to consider additional political, economic, and security options as Iraq starts to build a new government, and very much calculated to try to help stabilize the security situation, to expand economic development, and to strengthen the democratic institutions. Those will be the guidelines.
Roger Shanahan is a former Australian Army officer who served in Afghanistan and in embassies throughout the Middle East. He's now a fellow with the Lowy Institute and believes the biggest challenge for Iraq's new PM is forming a united team.
I think he will completely understand that al-Maliki's major shortfall was not being inclusive, so at the minimum he's going to have to choose his cabinet very well, not only to put the right people in positions of authority, but to be seen to be putting the right people in positions of authority.
The ministers discussed plans for humanitarian assistance to help thousands of Yazidis, a religious minority group who fled their homes in the country's north. Thousands remain stranded on Mount Sinjar.
But we are going to participate and deliver humanitarian relief in the nature of being able to drop supplies to them. That is a skill and capability we have long held, probably since East Timor. And that's the role that we'll carry out. We'll fit into and be part of the planning of the United States and other partners who want to assist on that humanitarian basis, and that's the way we'll go forward.
The issue of homegrown terrorism and return foreign fighters is one that Australia and the United States have agreed to cooperate. The two nations will put the issue front and centre at the United Nations General Assembly next month. Foreign Minister Julie Bishop says Australia is worried a number of convicted terrorists due for release in Indonesia this year haven't been de-radicalised while behind bars, and that it's a shared problem for scores of nations.
It's an international problem, but the barbaric ideology that these extremists embrace is in fact a threat to our way of life, a threat to our values. And we discussed ways that we can bring this issue to international attention.
Dr Russell Trood, a former Liberal senator, leads the United States Study Centre's Defence and Security program.
We've got to work collectively to try and find ways to de-radicalise those elements of the communities that seem determined to engage in this kind of lethal and frankly quite barbaric activity.
Secretary John Kerry says the photo of an Australian boy posing with a severed head, a picture he says is iconic, should prompt the world to act against jihadists.
This is utterly disgraceful, and it underscores the degree to which ISIL is so far beyond the pale with respect to any standard by which we judge even terrorist groups, that Al-Qaeda shunted them aside. And that's why they represent the threat that they represent.
Sabra Lane reporting.